Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina wa Nabina Muhammad, Nabiy al-Rahmah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi, wa sallama tasliman kathira. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Nabiy al-Mab'uthi, mu'alliman lil-nas, wa hudan wa rahmatan lil-alameen. Allahumma faqihna fi ad-din. Allah, we ask you that you grant us understanding of religion. وَعَلِّمْنَا التَّأْوِيلِ, and grant us the ability to interpret soundly. وَأَلْهِمْنَا رُشْدَنَا, and inspire us to what is right guidance for us in turning to you, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma ati nufusana taqwaha. O Allah, grant ourselves the ways of mindfulness, of taqwa. وَزَكِّهَا أَنْتَ خَيْرُ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, and purify ourselves, for you are the one to truly purify them. Anta waliyuha wa mawlaha, you are their care and protector and their master. So we've reached the fourth lesson of our lessons on Imam Shurunbulali's Ascent to Felicity. And today we're going to begin by completing the rulings of wudu. So the author, rahimahullah, tells us what are the rulings of wudu, and then we look at the things that nullify wudu. So he says, firstly, وَرُكْنُهُ فَرْضُهُ, the integral of wudu is its obligatory acts, which he's already covered. The integral is that which a thing stands by. If present, the thing is standing. If absent, it fails. Right? And then he says, وَأَقْسَامُ الْوُضُوءِ ثَلَاثَةٌ فَرْضٌ وَوَاجِبٌ وَنَفْلٌ. The categories of wudu are three: obligatory, necessary, and supererogatory. Al-awwalu, the first, meaning when is wudu obligatory? When is wudu obligatory? He says, لِلصَّلَاةِ مُطْلَقًا مَعَ الْحَدَثِ, for prayer, unconditionally. If one is in a state of ritual impurity. So anytime one is in a state of ritual impurity, it is obligatory to make wudu. Renewing wudu for each obligatory prayer or for each time of prayer is recommended. Even if one has wudu, it's recommended, but it's not obligatory. It used to be the prophetic practice, invariably, till quite late, that he would make wudu for each prayer, but it's not an obligation. And what does one do if one cannot make wudu? So one's in a state of ritual impurity, but one cannot make wudu. What does one do? Tayammum. Right? It has a badal. It has a substitute. But what does one do if one cannot make wudu and one cannot make tayammum? This is called faqidu tahurain, the one unable to perform both acts of ritual. One does not have either means of ritual purity, neither water nor the means for tayammum. Then what does one do? Go ahead. Yeah, it's not obligatory to pray. Simple as that. It's not obligatory. It's not valid to pray. Okay. Which should make travelers think. Because most people travel. Now, it may not be feasible to carry water all the time. You can't actually. If you check into the in the airport, you have to surrender your water, right? But is there a possibility that on the plane you might not be able to access water? Yes. So what do you plan to do? Right? Now, the strong believer is better than and more beloved to Allah than the weak believer, though there's good in both. Even the feeble believer, they wanted to do good, but they can't. There's still good in them, but they're not like... The strong believer is the one who takes the means, who's ready and able to take the means towards the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you travel and you don't have some means of making tayammum, you're kind of resigned yourself to, questionable circumstances. If you're on a car journey, you should keep some extra water. It's not that difficult. Keep a bottle of water. It's sometimes, even right here in Ontario, you're on the highway and there's no exit for like 40 minutes. And it's Maghrib time. What are you going to do? Right? Now you could make, if you have the water, you can make wudu, which is superior. And you get rewarded for, that's caution. But you should also have some means of, so all the things that are means to fulfilling the obligatory, you get rewarded like an obligatory action. Right? The things that could arise, so the one who is not able to make wudu and is not able to make tayammum, the prayer is not valid for them. But that's it. They have to just make it up. But the fatwa position taken from the position of his companions is that one goes through the actions of prayer لحرمة الوقت, because of the invaluability of the time, but then one must make it up when able. Right? So that's why he says للصلاة مطلقا. Right? Wudu is obligatory for prayer, for every prayer. And also, what if one wants to do a nafil prayer? Is wudu required? Yes. What about janazah prayer? Yes. With the exceptions that we'll look at. Right? وَلِسَجْدَةِ تِلَاوَةٍ, and for the prostration of recital. And for the prostration of recital. So, if you hear a recitation of one of the verses of prostration, or you recite it, but you're not in a state of wudu, you have to make wudu for it before you can prostrate. And likewise, any other formal prostration, the prostration of gratitude, sajdat al-shukr, for example, which is etc. It requires purity. And Imam al-Iraqi in his hadith compilation and commentary, Tarh al-Tathrib, and others relate consensus. Imam Nawawi as well, and Mullah Ali al-Qari and others, that there's consensus that any formal prostration requires a state of ritual purity. وَمَسِّ آيَةٍ, right? And touching a verse of the Qur'an. So touching the Qur'an itself requires wudu. Any part thereof. Like something is Qur'an, like is the Mus'haf. It's considered a copy of the Qur'an. Yeah. You require wudu to touch it. Even the cover, right? Or the edges of the paper, anything, right? And the same ruling applies to anything that is only Qur'an. Right? So for example, sometimes they have, Rubu' Yasin, You have the final quarter of the Quran from Surah Yasin onwards together. Or you have, one juz of the Quran, one sipara, like 1/30th. That, so what is that? You say it's Quran. So you require wudu to touch that. Something on which the Quran is written, but it is not Quran, you cannot touch the Quran itself there. But wudu for it is recommended, even books of tafsir. And then we'll see, although some said it's wajib with respect to books of tafsir, but we'll look at that. So the broad principle is Quran itself, wudu is obligatory to touch any part thereof. Anything else that contains Quran, you cannot touch the actual writing of the Quran without wudu. And wudu will be recommended for that when able. So what happens with a smartphone app, for example? Does your phone transform into the Quran if you open your smartphone app? Does it? So if we ask the question, what is this? Well, it looks kind of, it's my iPhone. What is it? It's a smartphone. Now I open the app, what is it now? What is it? It's still a smartphone. You wouldn't say it became Quran. No. It's still. So can I hold this without wudu? Legally, yes, but you cannot touch where the actual verse itself. Right? But you can turn the page, without touching it. But wudu is recommended. Right? Wudu is recommended, highly emphasized, etc. And as for touching a translation without wudu, there's two positions in the Hanafi school. The stronger and more prevalent position in the Hanafi school is that wudu is obligatory to touch a translation of the Quran. Because it is considered, it's Quran min wajh. It's Quran from one side. It contains the meanings of the Quran. Right? So, which is why Imam Abu Hanifa actually considered it valid for someone to recite Quran in translation in the prayer if they're unable to recite in Arabic. Then he went back on that position, fatwa is not on it, etc. But that's, so that's a matter of caution as well. But there's another opinion that is recommended because it's not Quran. Because Quran, the Arabic quality is inseparable from the Quran. But certainly one should strive to uphold what is superior. And then wudu is required, is wajib. The second category of rulings is that wudu is required for tawaf. It's wajib. And you say, but hold on. So you're telling me I can make tawaf without wudu? Yes, you can. It will be valid, but you are a sinner. And why is it valid? Because the divine command is to circumambulate the Kaaba. And circumambulation is not intrinsically connected with a state of purity. وَلْيَطَّوَّفُوا بِالْبَيْتِ الْعَتِيقِ. Let them go around the sacred house, the ancient house. And tawaf is a specific expression whose meaning is clear, is a khas expression, whose meaning is clear. It doesn't require clarification in terms of the action itself. Right? if you do that, you fulfill the divine command. Now there's details. It's established in the Sunnah about being in a state of ritual purity, but that's not a decisive text. So what do the Hanafis do? The Sunnah does not explain the Quran in the Hanafi school. The Quran explains the Sunnah. And you understand the non-decisive text, such as a Sunnah that is not mass transmitted, in accordance with what is decisive. So you can make, you're obligated to make tawaf. If you do it, you go around the Kaaba, that's tawaf. Being in a state of ritual purity is specified, but how do you understand the light of the sufficiency of make tawaf? That it's a requirement, but not an obligation, but it is wajib. So it's still sinful. If you don't do it, there's consequences, as we'll see. And if you want to see, you can just go ahead in the book, and it's not a murder mystery. You can find out what happens later without any religious detriment. So, you have to actually expiate for it. You have to repent from it. But it is valid. It is valid. So that's one. Right? And then Imam Shurunbulali mentions وَمَسِّ تَفْسِيرٍ, and to touch tafsir. Right? And there's two positions in the Hanafi school broadly. Some divide into three, but two broad positions. Some of the ulama, amongst them Imam Shurunbulali, chose that books of tafsir, it's necessary to be in wudu for because there's so much Quran in them. Okay? And particularly, they said, those copies of tafsir that contain the mushaf. Because not only short tafsir, like Tafsir al-Jalalain, for example, which is a short tafsir, but even some other tafsir, they'd have the whole text of the Quran in the middle of the page, and they'd have the commentary around it. So there's a strong, there's a jiha, there's a direction of that being Quran. You open it, there's the Quran. And then there's commentary around it. Right? And this is still very prevalent in a lot of Urdu translations of the Quran. Right? They have the translation under the text, but in the margins they'll have tafsir. If you look at it in terms of quantity or whatever, the tafsir is probably much more than the... So they said, but there's a direction of it not being Quran. There's the tafsir. So they said this is required caution, right? So they say it's necessary. And the third opinion is that if it contains the full text of the Quran, then it's considered like Quran, even if there's tafsir in the margins. But if it does not contain the full text of the Quran, right, it's just interlineal commentary, like they'll quote Quran and explain it, then it's considered like a book, a religious book. So it falls under the third category of when wudu is recommended. Wudu is recommended in many circumstances. And if you look in Nurul Idah, for example, it lists numerous circumstances when wudu is recommended. So he says, وَمَنْدُوبٌ لِمَسِّ نَحْوِ كُتُبِ الْفِقْهِ. It's recommended for touching the likes of books of fiqh, religious texts. It's recommended. Why? Because there's a general principle in our deen. وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهُ مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Whoever venerates the symbols of Allah, that truly is from taqwa that is in hearts. And that's a general principle. Right? That anything connected with deen, what is the basis of one's attitude towards it? It's ta'zeem. It is deep respect and veneration. Right? And this is a general text. Now some people say, well, where's the specific text for this? Right? Someone tells you, don't eat anything from my fridge. Say, but can I eat the cheesecake? No. Could I have some milk? No. Said, well, he didn't say anything about the bread. I gave you a general principle, so you don't have to mention every single specific. Right? And that's excessive, that's from the exaggeration of the literalists. Okay? And there's many aspects to this principle of ta'zeem. So for example, stretching one's feet towards the qibla. Is the qibla a symbol? Is it a religious symbol? Yes. We pray towards it. It's deserving of respect. Right? And what is respect? Right? There's certain expressions of respect that are religiously established, and there's others that are customarily established. Right? So putting the Quran on the ground, for example, is that considered respectful? Of course not. In general, there may be particular societal contexts that may be different, but in most societal contexts, if you put something on the ground, you didn't respect it. Okay? Likewise with religious books, for example. If you want to put religious books on the ground, or you need to, like you're at the masjid, the thing to do is to prop it up sideways. Right? So for example, you need to go pray, you don't know where to put the book, so don't put it flat on the ground, lean it against the wall or a pillar. Right? So if you can't find somewhere to put it, that's better. Right? But one shouldn't leave it on the ground. Right? Or if you have a bag or something, you put it on top of the bag, that's better. Any questions here? وَتَجْدِيدٍ لِصَلَاةٍ أُخْرَى, and to renew one's wudu for another prayer, particularly in another prayer time. Right? That's recommended. And they say particularly if you've been immersed in worldly activities or concerns. One of the wisdoms of wudu is that it helps one get into the frame of mind of prayer. Right? So even if you have wudu, but you've been running around, you're thinking about work, etc., one of the ways to help one refocus, you have wudu, but you renew it to get into the frame of mind of prayer. وَلِلْخُرُوجِ مِنْ خِلَافِ الْعُلَمَاءِ, and to avoid the differences of opinion of the scholars. Mainstream differences of opinion. Right? كَمَسِّ امْرَأَةٍ, such as direct skin-to-skin contact with a woman, meaning someone of the opposite sex who is not who's not direct family by lineage. And that includes husband and wife. Right? Now, anytime you struggle to practice something without harm, what you should do is, the Prophet ﷺ gave a general principle, إِنَّمَا شِفَاءُ الْعَيِّ السُّؤَالِ. The only cure for confusion is to ask. They say قَلِيلُ عِلْمٍ أَضَرُّ مِنْ كَثِيرِ جَهَلٍ. A little knowledge is more harmful than a lot of ignorance. Right? So the number of times I've been asked by people who want to be Shafi'i, say, okay, I want to go and sleep on wudu, but my wife insists on giving me a kiss before we go to sleep. And I forbid her from kissing me. Right? I insist that she should only kiss me on my hair, because contact with hair. So they fight. They go to sleep fighting every night. Okay? What is the greater harm? Right? So what do? Consult. There's ways to deal with these things, right? And they say, this is a general principle, that avoiding difference of opinion is recommended as long as it does not result in one doing something disliked in one's own school. Okay. But one first learns one's own school with clarity and confidence before one tries to go avoid other people's difference of opinion. Because that's like extra. But you don't busy yourself with extras. It's like you're a carpenter, you're making a table. First thing is, make sure the table has 4 sturdy legs. Then you make sure it's straight. Then you polish it. Once you've taken care of the basics, then you go and adorn the edges and do the artistry. But you adorn it, but it doesn't have 4 legs, it'll collapse. If it's not straight, pretty useless, right? Even if there's fancy decoration on it, right? So there's a prioritization. وَلِلنَّوْمِ, and to go to sleep. Especially if you're not in a state of ritual purity. Especially if you're not in a state of ritual purity. Some ulama have said, even if you are in a state of ritual purity, you make wudu to go to sleep, it's more conducive to better sleep and to sleep in a better state. Allahu a'lam. وَالْإِسْتِيقَاظ, and upon waking up. So it's recommended when you wake up to hasten to make wudu. A sunnah that is more important than making wudu when waking up is to wash your hands right away. The Prophet ﷺ said that من استيقظ من المنام فلا يغمسن يده في إناء حتى يغسل يديه فإنه حتى يغسلها فإنه لا يدري أين باتت يده. That whoever wakes up, let them not place their hands into a container of water before they wash their hands, because you don't know where your hands went to sleep. You might end up scratching this, that, so it's just out of decorum and then out of caution. But this applies not only to a container of water, but also other things. Some people go and they start using their smartphone, they'll do this and that. It's recommended to, when you wake up, first thing, wash your hand. It's superior to make wudu right away. And that way, sort of, one begins in a state of worship. Right? وَبَعْدَ كُلِّ خَطِيئَةٍ, and after every sin. And what's superior is anytime you commit a sin, to pray 2 rak'ahs of Salat al-Tawbah. This is from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith related by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu and related in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad and elsewhere. The Prophet ﷺ said that there's no servant who commits a sin and then goes and makes a wudu and does so well and then prays 2 rak'ahs and seeks Allah's forgiveness except that Allah forgives them. And so this is, but wudu itself is an expiation, as many hadiths mention. So wudu itself is an expiation. So you commit a sin, you make wudu. It would be superior to make wudu and to pray 2 rak'ahs and seek forgiveness, but wudu itself is expiatory. And they also say, and they give examples, and the Nur al-Idah gives many examples. Some of the books of fiqh mention one of the cases where wudu is recommended is وَالنَّظَرْ إِلَى مَحَاسِنِ امْرَأَةٍ, if you look at a beautiful woman. So there's a class with Shaykh Hassan Hindi. It's actually a class with like one of the scholars actually asked. I have a question. Yes. So yeah, Shaykh Hassan, is that before or after? And of course, the answer is of course obvious. Meaning that anytime you do something, it's not just something sinful, but you do something unbecoming, it would be praiseworthy to make wudu after. Not as an excuse that, okay, let me do something wrong, and then just, this is the eraser, but as an act of genuine remorse. وَقَهْقَهَةٍ خَارِجَ الصَّلَاةِ. Or, I forgot what the i'rab is right now. وَقَهْقَهَ خَارِجَ الصَّلَاةِ. Right? And laughing out loud outside the prayer. They said, خاصة إن كان على وجه الغفلة, particularly if done out of heedlessness. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, كثرة الضحك من غير ذكر الله تميت القلب. The Prophet ﷺ said, excessive laughter without remembering Allah deadens the heart. So, if one falls into that, right, if it's excessive or heedless or inappropriate, let alone if it's sinful, right, then it is recommended to, as an act of contrition, to make wudu. Of course, within the prayer, we'll see the ruling of that. So, any questions here?
So there's a question, is reciting the Quran wasn't mentioned, what's the ruling on that regarding?
Wudu for reciting the Quran is recommended. Not obligatory. Go ahead.
Touching the feet towards the Qibla, is it just the soles, like the bottom of the feet, that would keep the Qibla? Or if we angle our feet down?
Yeah, so stretching the feet means, such that the bottoms of the feet are facing the Qibla. So if you're sitting in a class, and you have, and it's hard for you to sit cross-legged or whatever, and let's say that, or in the khutbah, you don't just point your feet. There's a few things one can do, right? One is to have your feet slightly raised, so the bottom of your feet are touching the ground, for example. Or the adab is you cover your feet. Like most people don't have instant inability, right? Let's say they have bad knees, whatever. They need to stretch their legs. That's fine. But the adab would be keep a shawl or something and cover your legs. That's sort of, better. Or point your feet away from the Qibla. There's many ways to do it. Go ahead. Can you touch the Quran, like a verse of the Quran with a stylus if you're not in wudu? Yes. Some of the rulings related to the Quran come further when we look at major ritual impurity. But yes, with a stylus, for example, one can touch it. It's when avoidable, without excuse, it's makruh tahriman, prohibitively disliked, to pick up the Quran with something you're considered to be wearing. So for example, if this was the mushaf, I want the copy of the Quran, if I pick it up with my sleeve, this is considered to be, and I'm not in a state of ritual impurity, this is considered to be prohibitively disliked. Okay. But it's less bad than picking it up directly. Anything I'm considered wearing would include, like, if a sister is wearing hijab, she picks it up with the hijab, because you're considered to be wearing it. And they define wearing is anything that moves with your motion. So I'm considered to be wearing the scarf, right? So if it's on me, I'm wearing it. If I move, it moves. Then picking it up with this would be makruh tahriman, if I'm in a state of ritual impurity. Go ahead. Books of du'as are like other books of religion, right? But because books of du'as contain more, like the more Quranic content there is, the more content that it contains Quran, it contains Hadith, the more emphasized it would be to be in a state of ritual purity for them, right? As opposed to a book of Arabic grammar. But Arabic grammar is still, a book of grammar is still worthy of respect. Why? Because it's a means of understanding the Quran. Books of grammar often contain quotes from the Quran, from Hadith, etc. So they're worthy of respect as well. Some of the scholars said you don't need wudu to touch books of logic, but that was just out of frustration, right? Because some of the ulama didn't like logic, partly because they didn't understand it. It's like, where's the Quran? Where's the Hadith? Where's like قال الله وقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, right? But it includes both the works that are from revelation, the interpretation of revelation, what is derived from that, and the means of understanding, which includes the instrumental sciences, the ulum al-ala, grammar, rhetoric, logic, etc.
There's a cloth cover on the Quran.
Yeah, so if there's a cover on the Quran, if the cover is connected to the Quran, then that wudu is obligatory for it, because that's even if it's not stitched or anything. Like a lot of Indo-Pak mushafs have this plastic cover, but you could take it out, right? So that's considered part of the Quran, right? Because until you've taken it out, right? But if you have a sleeve that is separated from the Quran, then you can touch the Quran without wudu with that, but it would be recommended not to touch it without wudu, right? So you have one of those like envelope sleeves. You put it in and you take it out. That you could carry that without wudu, but it's recommended not to, and especially also to avoid difference of opinion of the Shafi'is, because the Shafi'is are much more strict about some of these matters. Go ahead. Sajdat al-tilawa, the prostration recital, we'll be coming to it, but once it's necessary, it remains necessary until performed. So if you don't know, if you used to recite a lot of Quran but never did prostrations of recital, then estimate how many you have and make them up. You can recite the Quran without wudu. Can you write it? Yes, as long as you don't touch it yourself. But again, the proper adab is to be in a state of wudu. Go ahead.
Is the wajib wudu limited to only tawaf and the book of tafsir, or are there other scenarios?
Broadly there's just one, which is the tawaf. Most of the scholars consider tafsir to be like other religious books. So that which is considered Quran, it requires wudu. That which is not Quran, wudu is recommended. Right? Tafsir, when the tafsir is akin to Quran, they would consider it obligatory to have wudu, like if it contains the whole text of the Quran. When it would not be considered akin to the Quran, it would be considered like a religious book. That's legally the more rigorous position, but because it's Quran, it's a matter of caution. So Imam Shurunbulali and others took this position. Go ahead.
Shaykh, about the qahqaha, the laughter, is part of it what defines it, that it has to be audible? Like if you stifle it such that you're shaking a little bit but nothing's audible, is it still
No, qahqaha is الضحك المسموع للغير. Qahqaha is laughing out loud, meaning it's audible to others.
So why are there only 3 mentioned: obligatory, wajib, and example wudu? Could wudu be makruh?
Could wudu be makruh? Yes, possibly, but that's already covered in the sense of those are the things, wudu with wastefulness, for example, etc. So wudu with those meanings previously mentioned. So it would be, so wudu doing the things that are disliked would be disliked. Wudu with leaving the sunnah would have dislikedness in it. Wudu could be haram. It would be valid yet haram. How could wudu be haram? Wudu with water whose use is haram. Wudu with boiling water. It's still purifying, but if the water itself will cause immediate harm. Wudu with clearly polluted and toxic water that will cause immediate direct harm would be haram. Wudu with stolen water. So you stole someone's water and made wudu with it, the wudu would be valid, but it would be sinful. Okay? And there's other cases. Okay? But they're unlikely. How often do people steal water, right? Especially around here, right? Any other questions? Go ahead.
Are these verse numbers inside the circles, are they considered part of the Quran as well as not?
The verse numbers are not considered part of the Quran. I mean, it didn't. Yeah, it wasn't revealed 1, 2, 3, right? Right. But can you touch those? Not part of a mushaf, right? On a smartphone, can you touch them? I don't know. Okay. Then, what nullifies wudu? So he tells us the things that nullify the wudu, right? And all of these share a legal meaning, right? They share a legal meaning, which is, and it's called this is what's called the legal cause, the illah, right? Which is the meaning that a text is based on, such as if found, the ruling is found, and if absent, the ruling is absent. Right? They say al-hukmu yaduru ma'a illatihi ithbatan wa nafyan. Right? A ruling revolves around its legal cause in affirmation and in negation. A ruling revolves around its legal cause in affirmation and in negation. In affirmation meaning that if the legal cause is found, the ruling that it is the legal cause for is found. And if absent, the legal ruling it's based that that it is the cause for is not found. And there are in usul al-fiqh they discuss what are the criteria for a legal cause. Right? A legal cause has to be definable, discernible, such that a ruling can revolve around it. The legal cause is often not the wisdom behind the ruling, nor the purpose or benefit of the ruling. So, for example, but it has to be something that, and there's criteria for it which we won't get into, but it has to be something, it has to be such that this is what, if it's there, the ruling is there, if it's not, the ruling is not there. But it has to be definable, discernible. It has to have an element of objectivity, right? So that the ruling can relate to that. Very often the wisdom is not definable, right? It's not objective in the sense. So, for example, what is the wisdom behind there being traffic laws, traffic lights? Yeah, prevention of harm for other drivers and pedestrians, right? Preservation of the flow of traffic, right? Etc. So there's regulation of traffic and the prevention of harm, etc. That's the wisdom behind it. But what is the legal cause of stopping at an intersection? It is if the light is red. Right? The light is red. Now, it is possible to find the legal cause, red light, without the wisdom underlying it being fulfilled. So you're in the countryside, and you can see in the prairies, for example, and you can see in the nice weather, you can see in all four directions. There's no cars, no human beings. It's just you and this red light. Why do you have to stop there? Why do you have to stop at that red light? Because the legal cause of stopping at an intersection is that the light is red. The wisdom is the regulation of traffic. But you cannot make an intangible, non-definable, non-objective thing the legal cause. Because otherwise the wisdom would not be fulfilled. If the ruling was built on the wisdom itself would not be fulfilled. So poor Zubair, poor Tariq, he's late for his 2-month anniversary lunch with Tariqa. Right? So he says, the wisdom of stopping at intersections, the prevention of harm. If I don't get to Tariqa, I'm going to be harmed. So can you jump the red light? You're going to be late for work. You'll be fired. Can you skip a red light? Can you? No. Because the wisdom is, the wisdom underlies the ruling. It is the aim of the ruling, but it's not the basis of the ruling. Right? And it's possible for the aim not to be fulfilled, but the ruling still to be found. There's no necessary relationship between the two. There could be much greater harm, but you have to stick. And that's also a broader thing. You have to stick to the laws unless there's a legal exception to it, not just a subjective exception to it. Right? So that's the. So now, what's the legal cause of wudu? If you look, and we've mentioned this before, that if you look at the things that are clearly established that require wudu, and you look at the verse of purification, right? And this is a deduced. There's two types of illah. There's an explicit. There are two types of legal causes. Some are explicitly affirmed in the texts, and others are deduced. And there's levels of apparentness of deduced legal causes, but this is, and the Hanafis argue about how apparent it is. They'll say it's very clear, but it's deduced that what clearly requires wudu is the exiting of filth. The exiting of filth. Then there's other matters that, if you look at the Quran, and particularly you look at the Sunnah, it's the texts. Some texts seem to indicate that they require wudu, and others seem to indicate that they don't. All of them, if we look at it, none of them contain the meaning of the exiting of filth, actually or effectively. So wudu is not required for them. And we'll touch upon some of these in a moment. The things that nullify wudu which are listed in the text are of two types. Some, there's actual nullification. There's actual exiting of filth, right? Which is if filth comes out from the private parts or filth flows from elsewhere and vomiting a mouthful. There's other things that are considered effective nullification, or the passing of wind. The passing of wind is considered to be from actual exiting of filth, not because of the wind, but not because of the gas, but because that gas passed through an area of filth. So it's considered to nullify wudu. Right? And there's effective nullification, which is sleep, loss of intellect, the direct contact of the two private parts, laughing out loud in prayer. The first three of these, it's because in these states, it's inevitable that something would have come out. Okay? Laughing out loud, it's a punitive ruling. Right? Laughing out loud during the prayer is a punitive ruling, as we will see. So the exiting of filth breaks wudu. From the private parts, when does it break wudu? كل شيء خرج من السبيلين. Anything that exits the private parts. What is خروج? الخروج عبارة على الظهور على رأس المخرج. Exiting is for something to appear at the point of exit. So if it appears outside the point of exit, it breaks wudu. If it doesn't appear at the point of exit, then it doesn't. What if you're not sure? You ignore doubts, right? From other than the private parts, such as from a cut or a wound or elsewhere, it's not just sufficient for it to exit, meaning appearing on the surface, but it has to flow, meaning to move past the point of exit. Whether actually that it did move past the exit, or effectively such that it came out and it had the force of flowing, but was prevented from doing so. That it came out, but you wiped it away. Or it came out and you soaked it up. But what if it had the force of flowing, but you prevented it from coming out, such as by applying pressure? What happens? Does it break wudu? No. Because it did not exit. So, from other than the private part, it has to exit and flow. And the actual and effective relates to the flowing. But it first has to come out. But if you put a bandage and you avoided it from coming out, you avoided the whole ruling. Any questions here? Go ahead.
It's a scenario question. I went into a bar downtown to use the restroom for wudu. So what's the ruling in that, considering that I assume they have a customer-only policy? So what's the ruling of using customer-only bathroom?
Okay, that's not related to wudu. Yeah. Yes, so but just since I'll throw something at you later, inshallah. The Prophet ﷺ said, so what is the ruling of using customer-only facilities when you're not a customer? They say, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يحل or لا يطيب مال امرئ لا يحل مال امرئ إلا بطيب نفس منه. The property of another is not permissible except with their willful approval. Except with their willful approval. So it's haram to use the property of another. I really had to go. Well, tough. Like, you can't. It's haram. Unless you seek their permission. Right? Unless you seek their permission. If they grant it, they grant it. If they don't, right? And that's very serious. I mean, laws notwithstanding, they say if someone forbids you, anyway, there's many aspects to that. You cannot. Right? Some things you can assume permission, because customarily known. You go to someone's house and you got a runny nose. Can you use a tissue paper? Can you? Yeah, because it's customarily known. And something customarily known is as if explicitly stated. If you're staying at someone's house, can you drink water from the fridge? Can you drink water from the fridge? Unless they told you no, normally people let you drink water from their fridge. They went to work. Can you eat cereal? I mean, if someone allowed you to stay at the house, you can assume permission to have cereal, right? Or like, but can you go into their fridge and find this very elaborately packaged box, open it up, and it says the world's best laddus, and eat one of the laddus? Can you? Can you assume permission for that? No. Right? So only something, you can only have that which it's obvious. It's clearly known that, and you err on the side of caution when it comes to the rights of others. Right? Without being a fool. Right? That which is customarily known is like that which is explicitly stated. And one of the adab of being a host is to make clear what was clearly allowed. Right? And if there's something that's excluded, to make clear that it's excluded, with discretion, with tact. Right? Okay. Any questions related to the nullification of wudu here, in terms of the exiting of filth? Okay, so what happens when, okay, go ahead.
Could you just repeat the part about the bandage again? The
Yeah, so if a bandage prevents the blood from coming out, then even if there is a deep wound, so there was force behind the blood, but you prevented it from coming out, it doesn't break wudu, because it didn't even come out, even if it had the force of flow otherwise. Right? And we look at the fiqh of bandage because it comes up later, because there's a number of important rulings related to it. What happens with a nosebleed? Okay? And there's at least 3 questions here that should have been asked. Okay, so like Uncle Rabbani is saying, I am disappointed. At least 3 questions that should have been asked. Right? If anyone was thinking, right? Which can't be assumed, but number 1 is, what is the ruling of a nosebleed? Okay. Can you see flowing blood from your nose, in your nose? No. Right? So if you think your nose may be bleeding, you ignore it. Okay. It's only when you're sure that it bled in an area of the nose that is considered part of the outward, right? Which is either the soft part of the nose or above that, because it's recommended to wash in ghusl, right? A little beyond the soft part of the nose. There, if you're sure that there was blood and it flowed, would it require wudu? Right? So you blew your nose and there's blood. But finding dry blood, does that break wudu? No. Why? Because you don't know if it flowed. Right? If you stick a tissue paper in your nose and you see some blood, does that break your wudu? No, because you don't know if it flowed. You have to be sure that it flowed in a part of the nose that's considered from the external part of the nose, not you feel some tweaking somewhere. That's just waswasa, right? But dry blood does not break wudu. The presence of blood does not break wudu. So that's the nose. What if you find blood in your mouth or blood on your gums? What's the problem with your mouth when it comes to discerning flow? The presence of saliva, right? So even if a dot of blood came out, what would happen to the blood? It would spread because you have saliva there. So then how do you tell if it flowed or not? Right? They say that which cannot be discerned in itself, one relies on a clear sign. Right? Sometimes you cannot discern the matter itself. Right? What itself breaks wudu in with respect to blood from the mouth or elsewhere? It has to. What does the blood have to do? It has to flow. It has to exit and flow. But you can't tell that with respect to the mouth, so you have to take some outward sign that would make you reasonably sure that that happened. So the outward sign that you rely upon is the color of your spit. That were you to spit out, if the spit is closer to red, then you can be reasonably sure that that blood was flowing. And if the spit is closer to yellowness, or it's faint colored, then you assume that the blood didn't flow. When you're in doubt, what do you assume? What do you assume? Yeah, so you can taste, you're in a meeting and you can taste blood in your mouth. What's your assumption? And you can't spit in the meeting. Right? So what do? What's your initial assumption? What's your initial assumption? What's your initial assumption? Validity. The assumption is validity and purity. Now if you can't spit, then what do? You exercise your judgment. Do you think that this is such that were you to spit, it would be the saliva would be closer to red? Because spitting is not always an option. You're riding on the train, a lot of people around, right? And it's considered wrong adab to spit in front of others, right? You do a little test on the subway. But literally, when you get off at Ossington Station, you have to just go into a corner and pray, otherwise the prayer time will go out. So what do? You use your judgment. Do I think this is excessive or not? If you have waswasa, you ignore doubts. Because people even imagine the taste of blood, and there is not a drop of blood anywhere. Right? So that's the second. Right? With respect to the mouth. Right? So if the spit would be closer to blood color, it would break with such bleeding from the mouth would be considered to break wudu. Otherwise, it's not. Any other obvious issues? Yeah, a blood test. So if blood is drawn, right? If blood is taken from you, right? Did it flow? Okay. It was not. It didn't. Did it exit? It was not. It's not considered kharij. It did not exit. It's mukhraj. It is made to exit. And the majority position in the Hanafi school is al-kharij wal-mukhraj siyan. That which exits and that which is made to exit is the same. So whether the pimple burst on its own or you burst it, the same. Something came out. Right? Whether you vomited or you induced the vomit is the same. And specifically with respect to blood, whether you bled, there's a cut or something, or you took the blood out, right? Such as, you stuck an injection, it took the blood out, then it's the same. The stronger position is that it requires wudu. Whether it exited by itself or is made to exit, it's ultimately the same. But there is a minority position in the Hanafi school that distinguishes between the two, which sometimes in hardship can be applied to a person who's sick or undergoing medical treatment, and there will be hardship for them to have to renew wudu.
So here it says sabilain, right? So from private parts. So what if we're in a medical condition where the filth is made to exit from somewhere else using the tube or anything like that? Then so it exited from the body, but not from.
No, but so if filth that exits from like a tube, for example, it would, if it comes out and it moves even slightly, it is exited. So basically, if someone is having, nasallallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala afiyah, we ask Allah for well-being, if someone, their urine or excrement or other is being made to come out from other than the private parts, it would be filth exiting from their private. It comes out from the body from whatever point of exit, and it flows. Flowing means it moves. Right? So the same ruling would apply. There's still one obvious case that you guys didn't ask about. Well, there's more than one obvious case that you guys didn't ask about. Okay. One obvious matter is that if filth exits from other than the private parts, but it does not flow, it neither breaks wudu nor is filthy, even if a lot. So, let's say, Tariq Bhai decided to follow the traffic laws because he heard in fiqh class that you must. And every light on the way home was red. So he shows up half an hour late. So he apologizes. So Tariqa, being aggressive, ripped off his shirt because she wants to beat him up. So he takes a pen and said, I'll write on my chest, I love you. But he didn't realize there wasn't a pen, it was actually some kind of stencil. So he ended up cutting himself. Right? So there's this whole wound. And this blood appears, because it's very dramatic. I said, all over his chest there's blood. But it just appeared. But it didn't flow. But there's a lot of it. So Tariqa, her heart softens. So she puts the shirt back on him. But now the shirt soaks up all this blood. What's the ruling of that blood? The blood's pure. Doesn't matter how much it is. If it exited but did not flow, it does not break wudu. So he could pray right then. So he prays Salat al-Shukr to thank Allah for the blessing of forgiveness from his wife. And so if it exits but does not flow, it does not break wudu, and it's not filthy. So that shirt you could pray in. And there's a principle. That which does not require wudu is not filthy. ما ليس بحدث ليس بنجس. And then flow is considered in one in one session, in one majlis. So if something is seeping out slowly, it's not considered to be flowing. So if you change a bandage and you see blood that seems to have spread, you assume that it seeped out, not that it flowed. people who have, skin conditions, acne or this or that or other conditions, they have, accumulation of pus, etc., and they find blood or pus on their clothing, they can, unless they're sure that it has flowed, you can assume that it simply seeped out and that it does not flow. Right? And Ibn Abdin says, وَفِيهِ فُسْحَةٌ عَظِيمَةٌ. Right? And this grants great relief to those who have wounds and who have skin conditions. Any if it seeps out, if it did not flow, it's not filthy. It's pure. Even if it's a lot. Right? Even if it's a lot. Like I had a friend who had this skin condition on his upper back, where at the end of the day, his whole shirt, and his undershirt, would be blood and pus. And he'd asked one of the, and this is the thing, he'd asked one of the Mashaykh, said, I never made wudu from this. I said, how did you know? He said, well, I asked one of the Mashaykh. Right? And that's the relief, right? That when something is not usual, ask, and you'll give you clarity and very often relief. So that's, if you find blood, you find an excessive amount of blood from a wound, for example, after the prayer, what do you do? So you don't know when the bleeding took place. What do you assume? So you prayed, say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and then you noticed there's a whole bunch of blood, like you're making dhikr, so and then you notice that there's blood on your shoulder, and it had flowed. What do you assume? You assume that it happened before the prayer, during the prayer, or after the prayer? After the prayer. They say, Al-aslu an tudaf al-hawadith ila aqrabi awqatiha. The basis is that incidents are ascribed to the nearest possible times. And that's part of assuming validity. You don't have to prove to yourself that it did happen after the prayer. You just assume that it happened after the prayer, unless you're certain otherwise. But certainty requires proof. And you don't have to search for the proof. So right? That's where Tariqa hit you with the stencil. She stabbed you with the stencil 5 times on your shoulder. And you prayed, Ya Rab. And after the prayer, you notice bleeding there. So then you don't deny the obvious, that this is directly ascribable to that. But when you don't know, you ascribe it to the nearest time and you assume validity. Flowing, that meaning at no one time is it coming out with the force of flowing. Right? So it's coming out very slowly. Like if you look at it, you can't see it flowing. Then if in one majlis, at any one time, if it doesn't flow, that's seeping. But what if it's but it's only considered flowing if it happens within the same majlis, within the same session, right? If it after half an hour would have moved on, that's not considered flowing. Blood that pools up on a wound is not considered to be flowing. So sometimes, if you took that stencil and you pricked it yourself really hard, you look at it, a drop of blood comes out. And actually, if you stare at it close enough, you'll notice that it'll pool up wider than the cut itself. That's not, did it flow? That's not considered flow. I'm sorry, I'm not going to demonstrate that. But if if you take a needle, for example, you prick a hole, and you could do it for yourself for demonstration purposes. Make sure it's sterilized and with due requisite precaution. So a drop of blood appears on the surface. It'll actually be bigger than the hole. That's not considered flow. That just appeared on the surface until it moves past the point of exit. No, one just uses one's judgment that it did come out with the force of flow or not, right? And when on shore, one assumes that it didn't. It didn't flow. Go ahead.
What if you have wudu and then you cut yourself and it starts to flow, but you put a bandage on right away, and then the prayer is about to end? Like, what do you do?
Okay, so what if you're bleeding? Now, if you stop the flow, then it's straightforward. If you have stopped the flow, then you can pray. And most small wounds, if you apply some compression, it'll stop the wound, stop the flow. That's it. So you can just make wudu again and pray. If it continues to flow, then that could be a chronic excuse, and we'll look at it when we come to chronic excuses, inshallah. But you can read ahead. Then we have a few answers on seekers related to that. Vomit breaks. Of course, there's one more case that didn't ask about, of course, which is, and people wonder about this a lot, is, and it'll come up in when we look at menstruation, but clear vaginal discharge does not break a woman's wudu. Right? If there is clear discoloration, it does. If it's clear, it does not. It does not break wudu. In itself, it would be recommended to renew wudu to avoid difference of opinion, but that's not obligatory. And there's a whole number of related answers to that on seekers, so you can look at the details. So that was another of the obvious questions that were not asked. That's part of preparation. Vomit breaks wudu if it's a mouthful, right? What is considered with respect to vomit is the vomiting motion, right? Not if you vomited in the same place. So if the vomit overtakes you and you run to the washroom and you vomit in 3 different places. You vomit on my seat, and then you vomit in the men's area, and then you say, I'll go to the women's area. So you vomit in the women's area, then in the corridor, then in the kitchen, then in the washroom. At no one place did you vomit a mouthful. The vomit is not considered by place, but by cause. The same vomiting motion. So a whole trail of little vomit, you would consider it together if it's from the same vomiting motion. But if you sat in one place, you try to make Thai food, but you got some ingredients wrong. So you're sitting there, you vomit a little, and then 10 minutes later you vomit, and you decide to make a legal experiment. So you want to see how much the vomit will accumulate to, so that's more than a mouthful. You don't consider the place of vomit, you consider the cause. So for different causes, you consider them separately. Now, how can you tell it's a mouthful? How can you tell it's a mouthful? Yeah, what you determine to be a mouthful. And you just ask yourself the question, do I think it's a mouthful? Yes or no? And you cannot give yourself a third option. You can't say maybe, because you can't do anything with maybe. Right? So when you have to make a judgment, you're religiously required to be decisive. Yes or no. You cannot give yourself a third option, which is maybe. If you do, then you're for sure going to be in a state of waswasa, of confusion. Because maybe is maybe yes, maybe no. So what do you do? Right? So how do you judge it's a mouthful? By personal estimation. What happens if a baby vomits on you? does it break your wudu? No, because it's your vomit that breaks your wudu. Right? So the baby vomits on you, what happens? Nothing. So you have a baby and like they shower you with vomit. You don't have to do anything. Yeah, if the vomit was more than the baby's mouthful, then that vomit is filthy. Right? So what happens? You'd have to remove the filth, right? But if the baby vomits and it's less than a mouthful, what is the ruling of that filth? It's a trick question. It's not filthy. Right? Vomit that's less than a mouthful, is it filthy? No. It's considered mustaqdar. It's considered vile. Right? It's not. You don't show up to work with. Don't mind this. Just a little bit of baby vomit. It's not something you'd present in front of dignified people when you have a choice. But it's not considered filthy. Any other questions?
A question regarding the blood. What's the ruling of like drinking blood? Like if you have like a cut and you put it.
Yeah, you cannot. It's not permitted to consume filth. Right. And it's also not willfully permitted to consume something that's considered mustaqdar, something that's considered vile. So you vomited a little, say, well, I'm sure there's still protein content in it, so you decide to swallow it back, right? Is that vomit filthy? Sorry for the gross examples, but right? There's no necessary relationship between purity and permission to consume. Say, but it's mine. Tough, right? So if you vomited a little bit, okay, so that steak was nice, let me swallow it back. No, right? Or you're a miser, you try to consume an exact number of calories, whatever, tough, right? It's considered mustaqdar, it's considered vile. So you have a paper cut. You can't lick up that blood and swallow it. If you can lick a wound clean, but then you have to spit out that blood, right? Even if it didn't flow. Go ahead. Yeah. Vomit that's a mouthful would be filthy, right? Even from an animal. And they talk about that. Raji'ul kalb, for example, the vomit of a dog, etc. It's filthy. All excrement and all urine is filthy, right? But there are certain things that are accepted. There are exceptions made to this. A number of those exceptions are mentioned in Nur al-Idah. And if you look at them, you can ask about them from there. So usefully, for example, the urine of cats is excused from carpets and furnishings. Right? If someone keeps a cat, of course, if you can, you wash it, right? But sometimes it can be difficult. Right? Like you got a cat against your parents' will, and it lightly urinated on your dad's recliner sofa. Just put some like talcum powder or whatever. You don't have to wash it. If you could, that'd be better. And we'll look at how you remove filth. There's more than one way of removing filth, but it'll be excused. It's hard to avoid. There's other things that are considered excused as well, and some of these will come up when we look at filth. Go ahead.
For the vaginal discharge that's colored, is there anything else?
Yeah, this discolored discharge is filthy, right? And because it comes from the private parts, its mere exiting breaks wudu, right? Its mere exiting breaks wudu. And if within the time of menstruation would be normally considered menstrual, although there's exceptions. And then in terms of area of filth, in terms of cleaning it, then follows the principles related to the removal of filth, right? Filth on the private parts itself is excused. It's sunnah to remove. Beyond the private parts, more than, the extent of a dirham, about 5 centimeters in diameter, is excusable. It's sunnah to remove, but excusable. More than that is obligatory, and we'll see those details, inshallah. Drowsiness does not break wudu. Light, when it's light drowsiness is as if you're awake. The sign of light drowsiness is that you can make out most of what's being said around you. Deep drowsiness is like sleep. Right? So you're kind of winking in and out, that's sleep. But one needs to be careful because it's easy to imagine that you're just winking, that you're just lightly drowsy, but you actually fell asleep for periods of time. Sleep breaks wudu if your rear is not seated. Right? If the rear is not seated, meaning that it's not resting against a surface. Right? And by the rear, we mean not the general area of your back, but by rear we mean where the filth would come out from, right? Where the gas would come out from. Right? It just comes out from one place normally, right? So that's what's meant by it being seated. Regardless of surface. So you're sitting on the ground, you're sitting on a sofa, any surface. Even if you are swaying side to side, unless you fell and remained on your side. So actually, if you're sitting, trying to go to sleep seated, and you're swaying back and forth, and you fell over but you sat back down right away, doesn't break your wudu. If you go to sleep leaning, it does not break your wudu either. You're leaning against the wall, etc. The criteria: rear seated, wudu is not broken. Rear not seated, wudu is broken. Loss of consciousness and sanity and drunkenness are considered to break wudu because in each of these circumstances, one loses. Loss of consciousness is like sleep. Loss of sanity, it's easy in that situation, to have lost control of one's bodily functions, and it's very likely that something may have come out. Drunkenness, likewise. So a lot of drunk people also, So, just the recap. Drowsiness, light is like waking, heavy is like sleep. Right? If the rear is seated, when you sleep, it doesn't break wudu. If the rear is not seated, it does. Any questions here? Go ahead, at the back.
So is the principle that filth may exit it, or losing consciousness and stuff like that?
No. So what happened? The Prophet ﷺ mentioned why. Right? I mean, it's textually established. Right? From a whole number of hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Al-aynani wika ussah." The eyes are like the rope that ties down a bag. The sah is like a leather bag, right? فَإِذَا نَامَتِ الْعَيْنَانِ انطلق السَّهْ. If the eyes sleep, that knot is opened, right? So what's inside the sack comes out, right? So that when you're awake, you have a certain control over. There's a certain tension to your limbs that keeps gas and other things just coming out. But when you go to sleep, the limbs relax, so it is likely that it's very likely that gas will come out. Right? Which is why they say if someone has just fallen asleep, it's superior to pray away from them. Because if someone just falls asleep, there's reasonable likelihood that they may pass wind, and that may disturb your prayer. Right? So it's better not. It's actually considered bad adab to go to sleep in the masjid, in the prayer area. And if you do, you go to sleep on the side so that people can readily avoid you. Because you may pass wind, you may snore, you may do other distracting things. Go ahead. No, so is vomit accumulated from, no, each vomiting, so if someone vomited and then 2 minutes later they vomited, the vomit from each of those two separate motions considered separately. But sometimes if one has vomiting motions, one will vomit and then vomit and then vomit, but it's from the same hayajan, from the same stirring, then that's considered together. But if there's a gap between the vomits, they're considered to be from separate vomiting motions. Then the last two things that nullify wudu, and we'll stop with this, is he says وَقَهْقَهَةِ مُصَلٍّ بَالِغٍ, the laughing out loud of a person praying who's adult. If you look in Nur al-Idah, he gives a much more detailed definition of this. Qahqaha is laughing out loud. Dahik is audible laughter, but it's considered, laughter is when you can hear yourself. Considered qahqaha when others can hear you. Right? So laughing out loud, such that it's audible to others. Musallin, and they say, in Nur al-Idah it says, Musallin salatan kamilatan dhati ruku'in wa sujud. Right? In a complete prayer that contains ruku' and sujood. So if you laugh out loud in the funeral prayer, you're a God-forsaken fool, unless, or just, that's what a faqih would say. Or maybe just something funny happened, right? But the fuqaha would not take lightly to that. But that's why they say be careful. Said around the fuqaha, mind your manners. Said around the righteous, be as you will, because they're not with you, they're with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So in a complete prayer, right? That in it that normally contains ruku' and sujood. Baligh, an adult. So if a child laughs out in prayer, if they're more than 7, we'd encourage them to make wudu and pray again. If they're 10, we tell them they have to make wudu and pray again. But it's not considered to nullify the child's wudu. But it was still considered to break the prayer, and we deal with them according to the principle of dealing with children. They also say awake. Because let's say you fall asleep in sujood, and you laugh out loud while asleep, it would break your prayer but not your wudu. Right? And that's not likely, but if it happens, that's the ruling. Right? So if you laugh out loud, meaning audible to others, in a full prayer, which excludes things like the funeral prayer. Right? The adult, it breaks their prayer and their wudu. The child, they're out of disciplining, they're encouraged or ordered to repeat their wudu and prayer, but it, strictly speaking, does not break their wudu. If you laugh out loud while asleep in the prayer, in prostration for example, the laughing out loud would have broken the prayer, but it would not require wudu. And this is a punitive ruling, because it's fully unbecoming the prayer, and it's established by specific hadiths from the Prophet ﷺ. And the final thing, which the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا الْتَقَى الْخِتَنَانِ, right? وَجَبَ الْغُسْلِ. And the Prophet ﷺ said, if the two private parts meet, ghusl is required. And by by their meeting there, it refers to actual intercourse taking place. But if the two private parts, right, the erect male organ and the female private part, touch without any barrier, should wudu be required? What's the obvious answer? What's the obvious answer? No, it should not be required. That's actually the position of Abu Hanifa's two main students. Why? Because do you know that filth came out? No. What do you assume? Purity. Right? What do you do with doubts? You ignore them. That's the primary line of legal reasoning. So Abu Hanifa disagreed. It's an example of what's called qiyas. It's what's called istihsan, legal preference. Leaving the more obvious line of legal reasoning, which is that no, direct physical contact, meaning of the male and female organs in a state of arousal, would not require wudu. That's the obvious line of legal reasoning, because you don't know that something came out. There's a possibility that something came out, but you ignore doubts. But Abu Hanifa said no, because in that state, is there a high degree of likelihood that something came out? Yes. But given that contact takes place, the high degree of possibility that if it came out, you wouldn't be able to tell. Right? Because so he said that this is a case of leaving the obvious line of legal reasoning for the less obvious because of secondary consideration. That given the high likelihood of something coming out, and the high likelihood that if something came out, you would not be able to tell because you don't feel it's coming out, and because contact took place, you wouldn't be able to tell that anything came out. Therefore, said this would be required caution. And this is istihsan. This is called legal preference. And that's the position of the school. Although a minority of Hanafi scholars took the position of the two companions. But this is the legal preference. Yes?
Why would the legal preference then not be to perform ghusl?
Because no intercourse took place. Why would ghusl not be required? But no intercourse. The two private parts touched, but no actual intercourse took place. If intercourse took place, ghusl is required. Right? Ghusl is required if intercourse takes place, or if ejaculation takes place, or end of menstruation or postnatal bleeding. No, because this is anything short of ejaculation, which is many, is just considered madhi, which requires wudu, not ghusl. Any sexual fluid that exits before ejaculation is considered pre-ejaculate, right? Considered madhi, not many, not ejaculate. So it does not require ghusl. Go ahead.
Shaykh, just a request. Would you mind repeating the Arabic of this paragraph here of the وَيَنْقُضُ الْوُضُوء?
I'll repeat it afterwards. Yeah. And so these are the things that require wudu, right? The things that nullify wudu. Anything else does not require wudu. Amongst them, touching someone of the opposite sex does not require wudu. I mean, it may not be permissible if it's someone is a stranger, it does not require wudu. Touching one's private parts does not require wudu. Actually, someone asked Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, because now the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man massa dhakarahu فَلْيَتَوَضَّأ. Whoever touches their private parts, let them make wudu. So someone went to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, said, if I touch my private parts, do I have to wash my hands? He said, إن كان على جسدك قطعة نجسة فقطعها. He said, if on your body you have any body part that is filthy, then cut it off. إنما الوضوء مما خرج. Wudu is only required from what comes out. Now, is he ignoring the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? No, because there's other hadiths that indicate that wudu is not required from touching one's private parts. How do you join between the hadiths? It's understood that the hadith I mentioned, wudu there, that whoever touches their private parts, let them make wudu, refers to the linguistic meaning of wudu, which is simply washing up. I mean, wash your hands. Right? Wash your hands. Because there's no legal meaning there of exiting of filth. Likewise, with respect to skin-to-skin contact with with one's wife or with one's spouse or someone of the opposite sex, does not require wudu. But in the areas where there's difference of opinion, avoiding difference of opinion is recommended. Now, some difference of opinion, like juristically, we may find them far-fetched. In one of the schools, and I won't mention the school out of respect, because there's particular hadiths that they are interpreted in a very literal way, that for a man, if a woman was alone in an enclosed space, like in a toilet, in a washroom, with a container of water, then a man cannot use that container of water. And the Hanafis would frown and kind of stare from different angles. But if you understand the ruling, it'd be recommended for you to avoid that difference, even if you don't understand why. And actually the Hanbalis, with all due respect, this is the Hanbalis, they'll tell you that this is a hukum ta'abbudi. There's no legal reason underlying the ruling. Said, we're just acting literally on the hadith over there. Right? And that's part of respect. Even if you don't understand it, doesn't make sense, it's praiseworthy to avoid the difference of opinion. Any last questions before we close for the day?
When following another madhab and if you validate something in that madhab, you have to make a wudu according to those conditions?
What do you mean by when following another madhab?
Sorry, when, like the example.
No, avoiding difference of opinion is recommended, right? It's not an obligation. Right? Avoiding difference of opinion. One thing, when you're just learning things, don't worry just imagine only one school exists. Follow that, learn it, operationalize it, be clear about it. They say, when should you start trying to avoid difference of opinion? When you know how to deal with exigencies that arise in your own school. Right? So you not only start practicing it, but the common problems that happen. Okay, I vomited, what would I do? All the unusual, the common unusual things. Once you're clear about that, then go beyond, right? And that's part of sort of that's the sunnah of gradualism. عليكم من العمل ما تطيقون. Take from actions that which you can sustain, right? And ما تطيقون, it's amazing. طاقة is that which you have the ability to sustain. It has also the sense that which is within your capacity. Right? It's an amazing hadith. ما تطيقون, that which is within your capacity. Don't overwhelm yourself. Don't take on too much. Right? So part of that, as we learn, don't be too hasty. Let me find out what all the other schools say. Just learn one thing. They say, irham halak, like have mercy on yourself. Right? Right? But in all of this, if one makes a firm commitment that I want to do things in the best possible way, but I'm doing what I can right now, you have the reward of the caution. You have the reward of all these matters. Right? So let's say you just learned this much. Right? And there are more recommended acts, and there's more sunnahs, and there's adab, and there's things that are mentioned in hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that the fuqaha generally don't talk about, nuances related to wudu, etc. There's other subtleties that come, and we're not going into all the details. But if you make the commitment that I want to follow the sunnah completely, outwardly and inwardly, as best I'm able to, you are rewarded not for what you are doing, but for your intention. And then you take it on gradually. And they say that applies to both to the quality of action and the quantity of action. Say, I want to follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in worship completely. And then you're building on that gradually. You don't just say, this is all I can and I'm going to do, and that's it. No. Then you'll be rewarded even for the sunnahs that you don't do. You didn't do duha yet. You didn't do tahajjud yet. You didn't do Salat al-Awwabin. But you're trying, but say, well, right now I'm beginning by working on my emphasized sunnah. Then I'll do the non-emphasized sunnah. Then I'll do duha. Then I'll do tahajjud. Then I'll do awwabin. But if you make the intention that I want to follow the sunnah completely, but I'm implementing it step by step, and you're serious about that, right? So you're consistent in what you are doing. And as you consolidate, you're trying to increase gradually, you're rewarded by your intention. So always make that high intention. That's why they say, if there's someone's raising funds for something, make the intention that if I could give, I would give as much as the people who give the most. You'll be rewarded for that intention. You don't say, I can't give. No. And the sign of that is you give what you are able to do. But don't just give that. That's being feeble. That's not the sunnah. The sunnah is you intend, Allahumma inni asaluka min al-khayri kullih. Oh Allah, I ask you for the good, all of it. Immediate and long term. Direct and indirect. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد معلم الناس الخير وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا والحمد لله